So the German Grand Prix was not only a circuit held at a circuit that is the mother and father of Grand Prix circuits, the Nürburgring, 14 miles of tortuous corners and hills and drops, and also some long straights, narrow straights as well. But also it was the home race of the major German Formula One team, by which I mean Porsche, he says with a smile, because Dan Gurney had done a brilliant job adapting the new flat 8 Porsche to his liking, setting it up the way he knew it could work, and won the French Grand Prix. Admittedly, a race that Ferrari, this is a little bit earlier in the season, a little bit that Ferrari had missed, because as ever, the Italian spring and summer was plagued by industrial action, which was affecting the Ferrari factory. It was a work to rule thing, which effectively meant there ain't going to be Grand Prix cars ready for every race. So Dan won at Rouen in the Porsche, first ever win for the Porsche Grand Prix team. And then came the German Grand Prix, when Porsche knew Ferrari would be definitely racing, with 4 cars entered. And they did what Mercedes probably would have done if they were in Grand Prix racing at the time. They basically hired the Nordschleifer. And in the build-up to the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, they not only did endless testing there with Dan and Joe Bonnier, the other driver, but also did a full Grand Prix distance testing with Dan Gurney. And to my thinking, that is possibly the first time, the first example of a team doing a full Grand Prix distance before a race, purely to check reliability and performance. So Porsche came to the German Grand Prix very well prepared. We should also put this race in the context of the 62 season, which was the second of the new 1.5 litre formula. And it was unbelievably competitive. The first round of the championship was won by BRM, the second round by Cooper, the third by Lotus, the fourth by Porsche. So there's 4 different manufacturers winning the first 4 races. Then Lotus won again at Aintree with Jim Clark, the new Lotus 25 monocoque. And then came the German Grand Prix. So, and Ferrari had yet to win a race. And of course, they won the World Championship in 61. And they'd revamped the cars a little bit. Not much more power, a little bit heavier actually. Phil Hill wasn't too happy. And the world champion from 61. And Lola had not won a race, even though John Surtees had looked very, very good in the Bowmaker Lola, run by Reg Parnell, powered by the Climax V8 engine. Should also mention that Coventry Climax were providing these V8 engines now that were right on the money in terms of being competitive with the Porsche and the Ferrari and the BRM. V8 format first appeared the previous year at the German Grand Prix in Jack Brabham's Cooper. And the Climax engine really enabled a lot of startup teams to begin their lives as well. Lola, good example. Jack Brabham, another very good example, won the World Championship with Cooper, 59 and 60, 61 with Cooper as well. But 62, he decided that he would do his own Grand Prix team and design his own and build his own cars with Ron Toronac. And along the way, having left Cooper, he ran and bought from Colin Chapman a Lotus 24, which he raced and did very well with. He actually won a race, a non-championship race, after the German Grand Prix in the Lotus 24. But the German Grand Prix was the debut race also of the new Brabham Formula One car, the BT3, finished in turquoise colour. And Jack was there with that, with the Climax V8 engine. Keith Green had a new Gilby powered by a BRM V8 engine. Keith Green, not a name probably that you've heard of, but very, very quick national racing standard driver, very good engineer as well. And later on in life would become team manager of Brabham. Interesting synchronicity there. But he was there at the German Grand Prix in this new Gilby designed by Len Terry, who would go on to achieve major success with Lotus as well. And would join Lotus very soon after the Nürburgring. So lots to talk about going into the German Grand Prix. Ferrari coming in with that 4-car entry, the Nürburgring itself, Porsche doing all that testing, very quick cars being built by Lotus, BRM and Cooper. What was going to happen? Well, what happened was that qualifying was basically confined to a dry session on Friday morning, and after that it just rained and rained and rained. That did nothing to put off the crowd. We talked today about large crowd numbers. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that over 350,000 paying spectators went to the Nürburgring in 1962 to watch that German Grand Prix, and many of them stayed overnight. Horrendous weather, and by race morning there were landslides and mudslides, and the race was delayed over an hour while that was cleared up. So the grid was very much defined by that early dry session, bearing in mind that in those days, 62, every lap you did in practice on Friday and Saturday was a potential time for the grid. There was no qualifying preceded by untimed practice. Every lap you did was a lap you could do for the grid. And it was Dan Gurney who got the pole in the Porsche. Beautiful lap by Dan. He looked great in the car, sitting quite high in the car, very tall man, but completely at home around the Nürburgring. Unbelievably difficult circuit, dangerous you could say today. But Dan got the car absolutely spot on. But the big drama of that Friday dry session was the accident that involved Count Godin de Beaufort, had a very old Porsche, Graham Hill in a brand new BRM V8, and Tony Maggs in one of the factory Coopers. This has a connection with where we are today, because before that practice session, Count Godin de Beaufort, this genial giant in the orange Porsche, private entrant, was approached by a German TV company who asked him if it would be okay to mount on his car a 16mm cine camera to film the lap of the Nürburgring for their TV show. And Godin de Beaufort said, yeah, absolutely. He was honoured that they chose him. And so the TV crew mounted on this bracket, this 16mm camera. And on Friday, de Beaufort set off. I've got to say at this point, there'd already been a couple of incidents of cameras being mounted on cars and coming a little bit astray, and some problems, and there were a few editorials in magazines saying this is not a good thing, we shouldn't be mixing television and Formula One. And so there is that context which we should always remember. Some people didn't think this was a great idea, but anyway, he went out and going through a very fast section of road called the Foxhole at Nürburgring. Bear in mind it's a 10-minute lap, certainly if you're going to Beaufort. This thing vibrated loose and came off the car. He didn't know that, of course. But there was a camera mounted behind him, and it fell into the middle of the track. And not far behind him was Graham Hill, absolutely flat out in the new BRM. And it's an S section of road where you're kind of locked into whatever you're committed to do, blind apices for 4 or 5 corners, slight drift on the car. And as he came around one corner, he just saw this camera, or a black object, in the middle of the road. And all he could do was straddle it, because he knew if he went over with one of the wheels, one of the tyres, a tyre might explode, or he might just suddenly turn left or right. So he tried to go over it, and it ripped the oil line out from under the radiator, and oil spewed over the rear wheels of the car, and he had a massive spin and went off into a ditch on the left, well below the road surface. Bear in mind that nobody at that point wore seatbelts in Grand Prix cars. It is unbelievable still to think that Graham Hill escaped from that, because he, at the time, observers said must have been doing 140 miles an hour. Graham himself thinks he was doing between 125 and 130 miles an hour, so probably that was more accurate. Massive shunt, high speed, and the new BRM actually had quite a high cowl to it, and that did a little bit of protection of Graham. Open face helmet, of course, goggles. He got out of the car, and initially, he didn't know this, initially a marshal had immediately jumped to the side of the track with an oil flag and a yellow flag, another marshal, and waving the flags like crazy to try and slow the cars down. But after a few seconds, probably 15 seconds or so, the marshal with the oil flag went to try to phone for rescue help and left his post. And Tony Maggs in the Cooper came there, didn't see any flags at all, and went off on the oil and had a massive shunt as well and wrote off the Cooper and had to race a much older car as a result with a 4-cylinder Climax instead of the V8. So huge shunt. In the end, both John Cooper and BRM, Raymond Mays, persuaded or managed to get the TV company to pay for the damage to those two cars. But so far as the weekend was concerned, that was a write-off, and Graham Hill had to go to a backup car. Actually, the car with which he'd won the Dutch Grand Prix, so there was a lot of history in that car already. More of that in a minute. And Tony Maggs, as I say, had to race that much older Cooper. So that was the big talking point of practice, of going into this very, very wet German Grand Prix. The other incident before the race, there were two incidents really before the race, but this one was truly before the race, was that Bruce McLaren had driven to the race with a New Zealand friend of his who's also entered but didn't actually start the race, Tony Shelley, who was a pretty good average journeyman driver, quite wealthy. And Tony Shelley had a Jaguar 3.8, and with Pat, Bruce's wife, and Tony's wife, the four of them drove from the UK to Nürburgring for the race. And Bruce on Sunday morning had his kit, briefcase and everything else in the boot of the 3.8, and it was all nicked. This is parked in the paddock area and everything was nicked. So Bruce had to race in Tony Shelley's helmet and had to go around the paddock borrowing shoes, overalls, all sorts of stuff, and raced in this sort of composite kit. Not very pleasant at all, as you can imagine. And lost his driving license, his passport, everything. In the middle of it's a quadrangle paddock at Nürburgring, and that theft occurred. Terrible. Anyway, the organisers decided that because of the delay and because of the mudslides and because there was a mist coming down and because the rain had eased a little bit, that it would be appropriate to break the normal protocol and give the drivers an opportunity to do one complete reconnaissance lap of the circuit before the race start. Obviously, they had to be topped up with fuel when they got back to the grid. But this was not a normal thing at the Nürburgring. Normally, they just went around the short circuit, did a loop, just and formed up on the grid. Because to do a complete lap, as I say, it's 10, 12 minutes from a standing start. But they did that just to let the drivers have a feel for where the flooded areas on the circuit might be. Bear in mind, no seat belts, and a few of the drivers had visors rather than goggles. But one driver who was racing with goggles was Jim Clark, who had qualified third in the Lotus 25. The car hadn't been running particularly well in the dry, and when it rained, it was obviously, but it was okay then, but it was no way of setting a time. So he was on the front row, P3, it's 4.343 grid. And on that reconnaissance lap, Jim had quite a lot of problem with the goggles misting up and a bit of water leaking and so forth. And he was faffing around with the goggles when he got back to the starting grid. And in doing so, he completely forgot to switch on the fuel pumps of the Lotus 25. He'd normally, ever since Monaco this year in 62, when the car had been very fluffy in the first couple of laps, he'd always switched off the fuel pumps on the grid just so the thing wouldn't flood, and then switched them on just before the start of the race as the flag was about to be raised. And on this occasion, because he was still faffing around with his goggles, he forgot to switch on the fuel pumps. So when the flag was dropped, he floored the throttle. There's a little bit of fuel left in the carburetors and then nothing. He stalled on the grid. So Jim Clark was basically last going into the first corner by the time he'd twigged and put the fuel pumps back on. So it was a frenetic first few laps. Phil Hill, who hadn't qualified well, he'd been out-qualified by Ricardo Rodriguez, who was effectively driving the fourth Ferrari. Willie Maires would normally have been in that car, but he had that big shunt with Trevor Taylor in the 62 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. Was injured, but not massively so, but he still wasn't fit enough to race. So that car was given to Ricardo Rodriguez. It was a 65-degree V6 Dino Sharknose Ferrari. The other three cars for Giancarlo Baghetti, Lorenzo Bandini, and Phil Hill, excuse me, were all 120 degree, more advanced cars. And indeed, Bandini had what was effectively the 62 upgrade as well. It was the first Ferrari since the beginning of 61 not to have the shark nose. And I will put a picture of that up now. There's Keith Green, there you go, in the Gilby, designed by Len Terry with the V8 BRM. You can see the smokestack exhaust. By that stage, the German Grand Prix BRM had got rid of those smokestacked exhausts, which I used to love, and they were down below between the suspension. And it's Bandini in the new Ferrari. You can see no shark nose there, and it's a smaller, lighter car. How did they make it lighter? Thinner gauge tube in the space frame chassis. The quickest in the oldest Ferrari, if you like, with the oldest engine layout, was Ricardo Rodriguez, the younger brother of Pedro, who had a yellow helmet, looked fabulous in the car, and was really, really quick around the Nürburgring. Although Ferrari in general, not that good. Here's a picture of Graham Hill. He brought back to the pits with him in the course car after that shunt with the camera, all the film, the cine film and everything. You can see there Jim Clark on the left, Raymond Mays on the right, and Graham Hill looking a bit dazed in the middle. And I've got to say, he did actually suffer quite severe chest bruising and a very sore neck. And later on in his career, he had another accident which affected his neck. And quite often he raced with a neck brace like Nigel Mansell. But Graham there, he looks relatively okay. He's obviously quite concerned, but he's, bear in mind the shunt he had. And then in the next day, he's racing the car, or 2 days later, he's racing the car. Very, very impressive recovery by Graham. They're all on the same tyres as well. Jackie Stewart's case in 68, the Dunlop wets were much better than the Firestone wets, for example. The Firestone wets were never very good, and the Dunlops were a big advantage. But on this occasion, 62 German, everybody was on Dunlop D12s. Everybody in the race had the same tyres. So no tyre issues at all. Anyway, getting back to the start of the race, Phil Hill from the third row made a pretty good start and was up there amongst the leaders for the first couple of laps. And the leaders were Dan Gurney in the Porsche, and the crowd absolutely loving it, Graham Hill, and John Surtees in the Bowmaker Lola Climax. A beautiful car, Eric Broadley space frame design, very quick car, and driven beautifully by John Surtees, who was one of the great Nürburgring drivers. So these three very quickly pulled away from the rest of the field, left Phil Hill behind. Jim Clark was forcing his way through the field, very, very difficult in the conditions, the mist and the rain for overtaking, but Clark passed something like 4 or 5 cars on the first lap and was up to 10th place within a lap or two. Quite easy to say a lap or two. Of course, remember, 2 laps is half an hour really, so in those conditions. So it's only a 14 lap race, and a very, very long circuit, and very difficult for those in the pits. You see them go past, and then they go back behind the pits, and then you don't see them for 10 minutes. Imagine what that was like for the team owners, just sort of watching the scoreboard and a dotted light bulb coming on what part of the circuit they were at. I remember it well, and it was, it was not an easy. I was there when Nicky had his accident. It was a very spooky pits, really, Nürburgring. There's big foreboding grandstands and all the history of the circuit as well. Anyway, after 3 laps, Graham Hill passed Dan Gurney to the astonishment of the crowd and didn't pull away, but he was in front now. So he had no spray to worry about, and he had a clear track, and he could think about, even though he was hurting a bit, he could think about keeping the car on the island and going as quickly as he could given the conditions. Now, what was going on with Dan Gurney? What had happened with Dan Gurney, if you please, was that one of the mountings for the battery, which was on the left-hand side of the chassis, had come loose. And Dan could feel that as he was driving the Porsche, obviously. He could feel there was something loose. And then he worked out, without having too much time to look down what was going on, that it was the battery. And we're talking the wet here at the Nürburgring. And so he spent about half a lap working out how he could wedge his leg in such a position that it would keep the battery as still as possible and still allow him to use the clutch the way he wanted to use it. And he did the rest of the Grand Prix distance like that, nursing this broken battery mount, but still driving beautifully in the Porsche. I mean, to me, this is one of the great, great Grand Prix performances of all time. Absolutely outstanding. And the interesting thing looking back now is that Well, none. I haven't read any contemporary accounts that mention that at all. Only one mentions the next thing that happened, which was that Graham Hill also felt something rattling around in the cockpit. I say rattling, you're lying in a semi-reclining position in this space frame BRM V8, and you can feel something's loose. And in his case, it was the fire extinguisher under his legs that was loose and starting to move around. Graham's solution, easier for him to do this than it was for Dan, of course, was actually to reach down and just chuck the fire extinguisher out of the car at a point where he knew it wasn't going to bounce back onto the circuit and get rid of it. And he did that perfectly. Incredible when you think now that what they had to do. Obviously helped a little bit by not having seat belts. They could move around a little bit, but the danger is just something that was not thought about. I mean, Dan's case, can you imagine now the Furore if you were racing with a loose battery in that sense, right by the fuel tank, which is also by your legs, and it's wet, and there are sparks potentially all the time. And then Graham with the fire extinguisher. And John Surtees having a relatively calm race of it. And very, very fast and very, very good. Graham Hill started to pull away about 7 seconds with a couple of laps to go. But then thought he saw some oil on the approach to the back straight and backed off, just because what was the point of taking any risk at all? I mean, in backing off, the gap closed right up again. And there wasn't much oil, it appears, because both Surtees and Dan managed to get through it without a problem. And so it was very, very close and very, very tense. But Graham Hill won it. Graham Hill won that German Grand Prix for BRM. One of the great wins, I think, of all time, given what happened to him on the Friday, given the conditions. You know, you put this right up with Jackie Stewart's at the Nürburgring in '68 probably, and Nuvolari beating the might of Germany there. And for Graham to have won in physical pain, as he did, was one of the great unsung heroic drives, in my view. Didn't, of course, end there at all. But let's just put the results up, and I'll go through the results as I kind of would if we were doing this as a contemporary Grand Prix. So there you are, August the 5th, 62. First, Graham Hill. Second, John Surtees. Third, Dan Gurney. What a drive in the flat 8 Porsche. Fourth, Jim Clark in the end. Jimmy got up to fourth place, was catching the top 3, but then had a massive moment, 2 massive moments actually, and just decided that he was lucky to have got back to fourth after the mistake he made, and he would continue to finish fourth. And as it happened, his engine started to go off a little bit towards the end, and so he finished fourth. Bruce McLaren, wearing the Tony Shelley helmet, finished 5th for Cooper. And Ricardo Rodriguez, sensational drive in the Ferrari, finished 6th in that 65-degree V6 Ferrari. Now look at that. Different make of car in the top 6. We were talking earlier about, is it unique that we're going into a season with no driver changes? I wonder if that's unique. I also need to get Sean Kelly to talk about 6 different cars in the first 6 positions in the race. That shows you how competitive Formula One was back in the early 60s. And of course, that would never happen today. It never happened in a million years. So, enjoy it. Enjoy it now as you're looking at it. Joe Bonnier, 7th in the other Porsche. Pretty good. Richie Ginther was a bit overwhelmed by the conditions in the other BRM, but did okay. Tony Maggs, excellent drive in that old Cooper 55, 4-cylinder Cooper. Giancarlo Baghetti finished 10th. You could say the other final point scorer, if you like, in the 120-degree Ferrari. He'd actually got passed by Godin de Beaufort in front of the pits towards the end of the race, but then de Beaufort promptly spun at the south curve and gave the position back to Baghetti. But for de Beaufort, after what he'd gone through with that thing, and obviously that embarrassing accident, to pass one of the factory Ferraris, pretty good. Ian Burgess, very underrated quick driver, in his old Cooper Climax 4, very good to finish 11th. Joe Siffert was running top 6 when he had a problem in his privately entered Lotus 21, still finished 12th, and got shortly afterwards was awarded the Von Trips Trophy for outstanding independent driver. And interestingly, he'd just been voted into the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, invited by Jim Clark and Joe Bonnier to join. Both of them big fans of Seppi Siffert. So that was a very nice thing. De Beaufort finished 13th in the end, ahead of Heini Walter, who was sort of paying Swiss in the Joe Siffert team, kind of helped make it happen, if you like, in an old Porsche. Nino Baccarella, who was mainly a Targa Florio expert sports car driver, but he was out there in Formula One doing a pretty good job. And Lucien Bianchi, the final finisher, of course, he was the great uncle of Jules Bianchi and the brother of Mauro Bianchi. So, that was amazing. We didn't all end there because, incredibly, there's some postscripts here. One is that about 2 months later, Bruce McLaren received through the post his wallet, not his passport, but his wallet and a few papers. It looked as if they'd been sitting in the bottom of a ditch for 2 months, which they obviously had. The organisers had sent them on to Bruce. There was nothing there worth keeping, but he did get the wallet back, I suppose you could say. But more significantly, probably, was that on the day after the German Grand Prix, it was Bank Holiday Monday in England, which meant big race meeting at Brands Hatch. And I'm going to have to look at my notes here because there's a number of them that did it. A lot of drivers who were at the German Grand Prix, competing in the German Grand Prix, were racing at Brands Hatch on the next day, including Graham Hill, who had had that shunt, won the race, was in pretty bad state, pain, and here he was scheduled to drive 2 cars for John Coombs at Brands Hatch the next day, a Jaguar E-Type and a Jag 3.8. And incredibly, the organisers insisted on all of the drivers in the Grand Prix attending the prize giving, quite correctly, I think. And I like to see that. And when I talk about, third-party commercial rights holders coming in and sort of the tail wagging the dog, these were the days when the circuit organisers ruled the roost. And if they said, you got to stay for the prize giving, or else you won't get your money, you stayed for the prize giving. And so all these drivers, there was Graham Hill, Roy Salvadori, who had driven the second Lola alongside Surtees, John Surtees himself, Jim Clark, Trevor Taylor, Lucien Bianchi and Tony Maggs were all scheduled to be racing at Brands Hatch on the Monday. They had to go to this prize giving, and as Graham Hill remembers it, they took off from Germany at 2 o'clock in the morning, private aircraft. I mean, in Jim Clark's case, he was flying with Trevor and Colin Chapman's private aircraft, and eventually got to England at who knows what hour, went home, in Graham's case, to Mill Hill, and then straight down to Brands Hatch to race with virtually no sleep whatsoever. And to his credit, Graham actually admits that he made a mistake in the 3.8 when he was having a dice with Mike Parks, I think, and his foot slipped off the brake pedal going into Druids, was wet again, and that was one thing, but that can happen to anyone, I suppose. A metal, the brake pedal wasn't that grippy. But more importantly, he said his reactions were not that good, and he just went straight on into the bank and had another shunt and hurt his neck even more. And then the following week, he was out racing a Lotus 24, would you believe, in Scandinavia, and qualifying sort of middle of the grid. The things they did back then. Tony Maggs, who had that big shunt on the Friday at the Nürburgring, and then had to drive the old Cooper and did pretty well, went back to Brands to race a Ken Tyrrell Formula Junior and won the race. Jim Clark went back to drive a Lotus 23, and the thing blew up. And Surtees was pretty good in a 250 GTO. But Mike Parks was the sort of star of that Bank Holiday Monday at Brands on the Monday after the German Grand Prix. And interestingly, Mauro Foghieri of Ferrari, who was becoming more and more powerful, with Carlo Chiti becoming more and more of the guy that had messed up in 62. Mauro was going to take over the development of the Formula One car thereafter, and of course Chiti was about to leave to go to start his own team, ATS, which was a complete disaster. Mauro Foghieri was at Brands and saw Mike Parks winning all these races, and that's why Mike Parks eventually ended up at Ferrari as a great engineer driver. So that's where it all started for him. There's still more, and I think you're going to like all this. I'll go through it as quickly as I can. But the car with which Graham Hill won that German Grand Prix was chassis number 5781. I've got a nice picture actually of him leading the race. There you see that lovely BRM. That's John Surtees in the Lola behind him, and Dan Gurney slightly off on the left in the Porsche, going into the first corner after the pits. And if we go back now to that chassis, that actual chassis, 5781, car designed by Tony Rudd, great engineer, eventually went to Lotus, but there he is with Graham Hill, Tony with the glasses. Tony was the BRM designer, who just was as good as anybody out there, I would say, in the history of Formula One in terms of what he's achieved. And you'll see what I mean just looking at these results. So in that actual chassis, that is what Graham Hill did in 1962. Those are all Formula One races. So he had what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 wins in that car, including the Dutch Grand Prix, the German Grand Prix, and the Italian Grand Prix, and went on to win the World Championship in South Africa as well. So look at that. That's amazing. Okay, so that was that. Now look at 63, and the car now has been sold to Centro Sud, which is it was a pretty good race team at the time, an Italian team. It was they did a good professional job, and it was standard procedure in those days to sell cars, and they would still continue to race. Look what happened in 63. Lorenzo Bandini actually got sacked by Ferrari effectively after that German Grand Prix, because he shunted that new car, went off at the carousel, and Ferrari were a bit annoyed and sacked him. So he actually got a drive with Centro Sud in that BRM that Graham Hill had won the German Grand Prix with, and many other races as well. So there's Lorenzo Bandini now, and the car's painted red, colours of Centro Sud, and here he is racing the International Trophy, not doing very much. BRM took it back for Monaco to have a spare car there for Graham Hill, not really used. Graham did drive it, but didn't do much with it. Then the French Grand Prix comes along at Reims, and Lorenzo finishes 10th. So by today's standards, he's in the points. Then the British Grand Prix, qualifies 8th, finishes 5th in this old car. Solitude, which is a wonderful circuit near the Porsche factory, qualifies 10th, finishes 4th. And then you get to the German Grand Prix. Lorenzo Bandini puts the winning car from the year before on the front row of the grid, qualifies 3rd. Okay, went off on the first lap, big shunt with Innes Island. But he out-qualified both of the factory BRMs in that older car, a year older. That's not because the new BRMs were terrible, because they actually formed the basis of the very quick BRMs that we saw in 64, 65. It's just that Lorenzo was incredibly good in that car. And that car specifically around the Nürburgring was a really well-balanced, drivable space frame car. Absolutely phenomenal. So look at that. And Lorenzo Bandini, to do that, what happened then? Ferrari said, "Oh, we've got to have him back now." So we'll have him back in the factory team, and he returned at the Italian Grand Prix driving for Ferrari. So after one more race, which was Enna, where he finished 3rd after qualifying 2nd, that was in Italy in front of the Italian crowd. Then he went back to Ferrari, and the car was then driven for Centro Sud by Maurice Trintignant in the Italian Grand Prix. Finished 9th after not qualifying very well, in the points again, you could say, in today's parlance. And then the last race of 63, it was rented by the Mexican hero, Moise Solana, and he finished 11th with it. Qualified 11th, finished 11th in that exactly the same car. So doesn't end there. Let's look at 64 now. 64, Goodwood, Richard Atwood is driving the car. It's now entered, on this occasion, it's entered by the factory again, the own racing organisation, and he finishes 4th at Goodwood. And then it kind of peters off a little bit. Monaco, French Grand Prix, Maurice Trintignant has now bought the car, and it's painted blue, and he's racing it with his own people, DNF and P11. But then the German Grand Prix comes along, Nürburgring, Maurice Trintignant in his blue BRM chassis 5781 finishes 5th. Unbelievable. Then finally, it did actually appear in 65 as well. Not much to speak of in terms of results, but look at the drivers who sat in it in 65. Chris Amon, and also Maston Gregory and Giancarlo Baghetti. So, pretty amazing. And it raises the question with those 23 top 10 finishes with that one specific car as to whether or not it is the most successful Grand Prix car of all time. I guess at the moment, I would have been thinking it was the Red Bull RB19 of 2023, Max Verstappen, assuming he did drive the same chassis all year, which I think he did. But even so, that's 22 top 10s for that car. This is 23 for the 62 BRM. So there we are. Hope you enjoyed that. 62 German Grand Prix.